Voters 65 and older helped Donald Trump secure a win back in 2016, but new polling shows that in 2020, more of those voters support Joe Biden. NBC News Now correspondent Dasha Burns spoke with some seniors in Newport Richey, Florida.
Hey, Allison, it turns out if you want to get seniors in sweltering hot Florida to talk to you about politics, you catch them at the pool after they've done a couple of laps or a little bit of water aerobics, and that is exactly what we did. This is an area that has a large population of voters over the age of 65, and they are largely what helped Trump really expand the margin of victory for the GOP here. He won by 21 points. Compare that to 2012 with Mitt Romney when he only won by 7 points here. And the question I came here with is that enthusiasm holding? And the answer that I got, Allison, is largely a resounding yes. And when I talk to voters about some of the priorities, considering the coronavirus pandemic has hit this state and this demographic particularly hard, take a listen to some of what I heard. How worried are you about the coronavirus pandemic?
I'm not.
You're not? Why not?
Now I'm not, because I've seen what happens. A lot of people that they say are dying of it are not. They're just putting that down on the death certificate.
Are you saying you don't believe that as many people have died from it as
Oh, definitely not.
What concerns me are those folks that are naysayers or people that don't believe that we've got a problem. Those that believe it's a hoax, so to speak. Those that say, well, I don't know anybody that's had the virus, so it must not be a virus. I have someone that's passed away from the virus. I've had people that have been hospitalized by the virus. I know it's real.
And Allison, of course, that soundbite about deaths is an example of the spread of misrepresentation. NBC News has been gathering data from health departments across the country and is now reporting more than 180,000 people dead from this virus. But interestingly, this did not seem to be the top priorities for voters that I've talked to here. Instead, there were folks focused on something else. Take a listen. What is your top concern? What is it that keeps you up at night?
The lawlessness in the cities where the mayors and governors of Portland, Seattle, Minnesota, where they don't stop it. They just let it keep on going on. And I'm afraid it'll come here.
This is the way the things go on in the United States right now. It's happening in other states and it's spreading over the nation. I just don't like it.
What are you referring to?
Well, the riots and stuff like that.
So, Allison, clearly the president's law and order message, while it may not be working in some places, does seem to resonate with folks here. Allison?
How are you voting in the 2020 presidential election? NBC News has a great new tool to help you figure that out. It's called Playing Your Vote, a state-by-state guide on voting rules, deadlines, and restrictions. Check it out at nbcnews.com/playingyourvote.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.